Most prison sentences come with an end date, a number on a calendar, something to count down to. But for the women on this list, that number either didn't exist or stretched so far into the future that freedom felt more like a concept than a possibility. Some were teenagers when they went in. Some were grandmothers when they came out, and a few barely made it out at all. Betty Smithy.
49 years behind bars for killing a 15-month-old girl she was babysitting. She was supposed to serve a life sentence, but Governor Jan Brewer...
She was just 20 years old and had already been through the foster care system, survived abuse, and carried a juvenile kidnapping conviction on her record. So when she was hired as a live-in babysitter in Northwest Phoenix, her life was already on shaky ground. Less than a week into the job, on New Year's Day, she strangled 15-month-old Sandy Gerberick inside the home. A jury convicted her of first-degree murder, and the court handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Under Arizona law at the time, the only person who could change that was the sitting governor. For the first couple of decades behind bars, Smithy was far from a model inmate. She attempted to escape 4 times, but in 1983, something shifted. The victim's mother, Emma Simmons, sent Smithy a letter forgiving her for what she had done. That letter changed the trajectory of her time inside. She earned her GED, completed college credits, and started writing poetry. She went from being a flight risk to one of the most reformed inmates in the Arizona system. She appealed to multiple governors over the years, but it was Governor Jan Brewer who finally approved her clemency request. Brewer commuted her sentence to 48 years to life, which made her eligible for a parole hearing. On the 13th of August 2012, the Arizona Board of Executive Clemency voted to release her. She walked out of the Perryville State Prison at 69 years old, using a cane, after 49 years behind bars. She had been the longest-serving female inmate in the country. Mary Virginia Jones.
Today granted her release from prison. Advocates say it's also a step forward for victims of abuse.
Before 1981, she had never been in trouble with the law. She was a church-going woman who worked as a teacher's aide in Los Angeles, raising her daughter and living a quiet life. But then she met Mose Willis, a man with a violent past and convictions for manslaughter and weapons charges, and everything changed. Willis was abusive and controlling, and he had threatened to kill both Jones and her daughter if she ever went to the police. 1 week before the crime, he fired a gun at her daughter. So when Willis forced Jones at gunpoint on the 3rd of April 1981 to drive a car carrying 2 kidnapped drug dealers to a back alley in South Los Angeles, she did what she was told. Willis shot both men, killing one of them. Jones ran from the scene, fully expecting a bullet in her back. She hid at a friend's house and was arrested days later. Her case went through the courts 4 separate times. The first conviction was overturned on appeal. The second trial ended in a hung jury. The third convicted her only on robbery charges. But prosecutors kept pushing, and in 1987, she was finally convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Willis was sentenced to death and died on death row in 1988. Law students at USC's Post-Conviction Justice Project eventually took up her case, arguing that the jury never heard testimony about the effects of intimate partner battering. In March 2014, a Los Angeles judge allowed her to plead no contest to voluntary manslaughter. She walked out of custody at 74 years old after 32 years behind bars. Gloria Williams. In 1971, Gloria Williams was a 25-year-old mother of 5 living in a difficult situation. Her second husband had introduced her to heroin, and the cycle of addiction and abuse had taken hold. That year, she and 2 others attempted to rob a grocery store in Opelousas, Louisiana. Williams carried a toy gun that belonged to her son, and another co-defendant had an unloaded rifle wrapped in a coat. The store owner, 64-year-old Budge Cutrera Sr., pulled his own gun in self-defense. During the struggle, Cutrera was shot and killed with his own weapon. Williams did not pull the trigger, but she was convicted by an all-white jury of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Over the next several years, she escaped from prison 3 times. One escape took her all the way to Houston, where she was arrested on an unrelated armed robbery charge and spent 8 years in a Texas prison before being returned to Louisiana to resume her life sentence. But something in Williams eventually settled. She became a mentor to younger women inside the facility, counseling them and guiding them through their time. The other inmates gave her the name Mama Glow, Her commutation packet would later include 43 certificates from 17 programs and recommendations from prison administrators and the women she mentored. In July 2019, the Louisiana Board of Pardons unanimously recommended her for clemency. Governor John Bell Edwards signed her commutation papers in 2021, and the parole board held a final hearing in January 2022. On the 25th of January 2022, Williams walked out of the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women at 76 years old, after 51 years behind bars. Judith Clark.
Right now at 5:30, breaking news just into our newsroom. Judith Clark, the getaway driver involved in the notorious and deadly Brinks truck heist in 1981.
On the 20th of October 1981, a group of radical activists carried out a robbery of a Brinks armored truck at the Nanuet Mall in Nanuet, New York. The haul was $1.6 million. Brinks guard Peter Page was killed during the initial attack. After the robbery, the group split up, and some of them engaged in a shootout with police at a roadblock nearby, killing officers Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown. Judith Clark was the getaway driver. She was a member of the May 19th Communist Organization, an offshoot of the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army. At her trial, Clark refused to participate in her own defense and declared herself a prisoner of war. The court gave her 75 years to life. At that sentence, she would have died behind bars. For years, Clark was exactly the kind of inmate the system wanted nothing to do with. But over the decades, something shifted. She trained service dogs for people with disabilities through the Puppies Behind Bars program. She founded an AIDS education program inside the facility. She counseled mothers who were incarcerated while pregnant and helped them prepare for the reality of raising children from behind bars. In December 2016, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo commuted her sentence, praising her transformation. She was initially denied parole in April 2017 amid fierce opposition from law enforcement groups and victims' families. But in April 2019, the board granted her release in a 2-to-1 decision. On the 10th of May 2019, Clark walked out of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility at 69 years old. She had spent more than 37 years in prison. She moved to Manhattan and began working for Our Children, an organization that helps incarcerated women and their children rejoin their communities. Cyntoia Brown.
Cyntoia Brown is now out of prison. Brown has been serving a life sentence in Nashville for the murder of a man she said solicited her for sex when she was 16 years old. Former Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam commuted Brown's sentence in January.
On the night of the 6th of August, 2004, 43-year-old real estate agent Johnny Allen picked up a 16-year-old girl near a Sonic drive-in in Nashville, Tennessee, and brought her to his home. That girl was Cyntoia Brown. Brown had been living with a 24-year-old man who went by the name Cutthroat. He had forced her into prostitution and physically and verbally abused her after she ran away from her adoptive family. On the night in question, Brown said Allen had told her he was a former sharpshooter in the army. She said she feared for her life. She shot Allen in the back of the head with a handgun. Prosecutors argued that Allen was asleep when she shot him and that she then stole his wallet, guns, and truck. Brown maintained it was self-defense, saying Allen had reached for something and she feared for her life. In 2006, she was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 51 years. She was 16 years old at the time of the crime. Her defense argued she had been a victim of sex trafficking and that fetal alcohol syndrome had impaired her mental development since her biological mother had drunk alcohol throughout the pregnancy. Behind bars, Brown became an ordained minister and mentored other inmates. Her case gained national attention after celebrities including Kim Kardashian and Rihanna began sharing her story on social media. In January 2019, outgoing Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted her clemency. On the 7th of August 2019, Brown walked out of the Tennessee prison for women at 31 years old. She remains on parole supervision for 10 years. Donna Hilton.
Donna Hilton says now with every hug and kind word she gives to another woman in pain, she is helping heal herself.
I was a little girl being abused and I was traumatized and no one was helping.
In March 1985, Donna Hilton and 6 others drugged and kidnapped 62-year-old Long Island real estate broker Thomas Vigliarolo at the direction of a man named Louis Miranda. Miranda believed Vigliarolo had cheated him out of $139,000 on a con they had both been running. The group held Vigliarolo captive for 15 to 20 days. During that time, they starved, burned, beat, and tortured him. He died of asphyxiation. After his death, they stuffed his body in a trunk and attempted to collect a ransom. Hilton was 20 years old at the time. She had been born in Jamaica and brought to the United States as a child. She had a history of childhood sexual abuse and trafficking-like exploitation. She claimed she was coerced into participating by Miranda, who threatened her young daughter. Hilton's role included delivering a ransom note, which is how police eventually tracked her down. In March 1986, a jury convicted her of second-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. While incarcerated, Hilton earned a bachelor's degree in behavioral sciences and a master's degree in English from Mercy College. She was ordained as a Christian minister in 2011. Over the years, she became an outspoken activist for the rights of incarcerated women and survivors of abuse. In January 2012, after serving 27 years, she was paroled at 47 years old. She went on to speak at the Women's March on Washington in 2017 and participated in a video montage at the 2020 Democratic National Convention. Her story remains divisive, with many pointing to the brutality of the crime itself. Alice Marie Johnson.
A Mid-South native who spent over 2 decades in prison is living a life she says she never could have imagined. Alice Johnson was pardoned by President Trump back in 2020, and since being released from prison,
she was a former FedEx employee in Memphis, Tennessee who had hit rock bottom. Her son had been murdered. Her marriage had collapsed. A gambling addiction spiraled into financial ruin and eventually into bankruptcy. In the early 1990s, she became involved in a Memphis-based cocaine trafficking operation. In 1996, Johnson was convicted of 8 federal counts related to cocaine trafficking and money laundering conspiracy. She received a sentence of life in prison plus 25 years, without the possibility of parole. It was her first criminal offense. Under federal conspiracy law, she was held responsible for the entire scope of the drug operation, even though she had never personally handled any of the drugs. Johnson spent more than 2 decades behind bars. In that time, she became an ordained minister, a published writer, a mentor to other inmates, and a model prisoner with a spotless disciplinary record. Her case gained attention when reality television star Kim Kardashian West saw a video of Johnson telling her story from prison. Kardashian began advocating for her release, eventually meeting with President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and then with the president himself at the White House on the 30th of May 2018. On the 6th of June 2018, Trump commuted Johnson's sentence. She was 63 years old when she walked out of the federal prison in Aliceville, Alabama, where she had been held since her conviction. On the 28th of August 2020, Trump went a step further and granted her a full presidential pardon. Since her release, Johnson has become one of the most visible advocates for criminal justice reform in the country. She spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2020. Debbie Sims, Africa.
During the siege on Move's house, gunfire was exchanged and a police officer named James Ramp was killed.
On the 8th of August, 1978, Philadelphia police surrounded the Powelton Village headquarters of a radical group called Move and entered the compound by force after a lengthy standoff. During the siege, Philadelphia police officer James Ramp was struck and killed by gunfire. Move members have long maintained that Ramp was killed by friendly fire from another officer, but no evidence presented at trial supported that claim conclusively. 9 Move members, including 22-year-old Debbie Sims, Africa, were arrested. In the highly politicized trial that followed, all 9 were convicted of third-degree murder, and each sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison. No evidence was presented showing that any of the Move women had handled firearms during the confrontation. Many observers and legal experts have questioned the fairness of the trial, arguing that the political nature of Move influenced the outcome. While incarcerated, Debbie gave birth to her son, Michael Africa Jr. She secretly kept the newborn hidden for 3 days before prison staff discovered him. Michael was taken from her and raised by family outside. Over the next 4 decades, Debbie earned degrees and became a mentor and dog trainer in the prison. 2 of the Move 9 died behind bars. The rest became eligible for parole in 2008, but were repeatedly denied. In May 2018, Debbie, Janet, and Janine Africa all went before the parole board on the same day. Only Debbie was granted release. On the 16th of June 2018, she walked out of the state correctional institution at Cambridge Springs in Pennsylvania at 62 years old, making her the first of the Move 9 to be freed. She had served 40 years. Sarah Cruzan.
Sarah Cruzan was 16 when she was charged with murdering the man who forced her into prostitution. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But this week, Carter Evans tells us she'll be freed.
George Gilbert Howard started grooming Sarah Cruzan when she was 11 years old. By the time she was 13, he was trafficking her for sex in Riverside, California. He was her pimp and her abuser. In 1994, when she was 16, Cruzan shot and killed Howard in a Riverside motel room. Prosecutors argued that Cruzan was no longer working for Howard at the time and that the killing was premeditated. She was tried as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 17 at sentencing. The court treated her as a cold-blooded killer, and the system offered her no path to freedom. Cruzan's case drew increasing attention over the years, particularly after Human Rights Watch posted a 6-minute interview with her on YouTube in 2010. In it, she described the years of grooming and abuse she had suffered at Howard's hands. Her story became a focal point for lawmakers and reform groups pushing to soften harsh sentences for juveniles tried as adults. In January 2011, on his last full day in office, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence to 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. He acknowledged that the sentence was excessive given her age and the significant abuse she had suffered. In January 2013, a Riverside County judge reduced her conviction from first-degree to second-degree murder under a new California law allowing the resentencing of certain inmates convicted as juveniles. She was paroled later that year after serving 19 years. On the 1st of July 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom granted her a full pardon. Since her release, Cruzan has worked as a parole justice advocate at Uncommon Law. Tondalau Hall. In 2004, 19-year-old Tondalau Hall was living in Oklahoma with her boyfriend, Robert Braxton Jr. Braxton was violently abusive toward both Hall and their children. He broke the ribs and femur of their 20-month-old child and fractured the ribs, femur, and toe of their 2.5-month-old. Braxton admitted to the abuse. He pleaded guilty and received a 10-year suspended sentence with credit for 2 years he had already spent in jail. He walked out of the courtroom on probation and never spent a day in prison for what he did. Hall, on the other hand, was charged under Oklahoma's failure to protect statute for not reporting the abuse to authorities. She signed a blind plea deal without fully understanding the consequences and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. She was a victim of Braxton's verbal, physical, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse herself, but none of that factored into the sentence. The disparity between the two punishments drew national attention. In 2017, the American Civil Liberties Union of Oklahoma filed a lawsuit challenging the sentence as disproportionate. Hall's case became a symbol of the failures baked into Oklahoma's failure to protect laws. The state has the highest female incarceration rate in the country, and more than half of its female inmates are survivors of domestic violence. In October 2019, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 5-0 to recommend her sentence be commuted. Governor Kevin Stitt signed off on the commutation. On the 8th of November 2019, Hall walked out of the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center at 35 years old after 15 years. Braxton, the man who admitted to breaking their children's bones, had been free the entire time. Ramona Brandt.
In 1995, I was sentenced to life in prison for a first-time nonviolent drug offense. And December 18, 2015, I received a letter from President Obama.
She grew up on Long Island, New York, with a strong family and a father who made sure she was raised in the church. But later in life, after moving to Charlotte, North Carolina, she entered a relationship with a man who became abusive. He was also a drug dealer. In 1995, Brandt was charged with conspiracy to possess and distribute cocaine and cocaine base. She was a first-time offender. There was no violence in her case, but under federal conspiracy law, she was held responsible for the full scope of the operation. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Even the judge who handed down the sentence said he was shocked at its severity. Behind bars, Brandt was a model inmate for more than 20 years. She completed a 500-hour drug treatment program, earned a certificate in office administration from Marist College, directed the prison choir at Danbury, took cooking classes, and served as a companion for women on suicide watch. She never had a single disciplinary incident in 2 decades of incarceration. She was ranked 3rd on the Can Do Foundation's list of the 25 women most deserving of clemency. On the 18th of December 2015, President Barack Obama commuted her sentence, along with 94 other federal inmates. On the 2nd of February 2016, Brandt walked out of prison at 52 years old after 21 years behind bars. She later met President Obama at a restaurant in Washington called Busboys and Poets, where he took her and other clemency recipients to lunch. Ramona Brandt died on the 25th of February 2018. She was 54 years old. She had been free for just 2 years. Nicole Boynton.
For the first time in Georgia history, a woman serving a life sentence is free because of a new state law designed to protect survivors of abuse. Caitlin Ross joining us to talk more about a story about Nicole Boynton. She spent 23 years behind bars.
On the 30th of September 1999, an argument between 18-year-old Nicole Boynton and her boyfriend, Ronnie Moss II, turned physical inside their Cobb County, Georgia townhome. Moss was punching her. A group of middle school-aged girls from the neighborhood overheard the commotion and knocked on the door. Moss answered and told them everything was fine. After they left, Boynton grabbed a steak knife from the kitchen. In the confrontation that followed, she stabbed Moss. He died from the injuries. Boynton had endured years of physical and sexual abuse, starting in childhood and continuing through her relationship with Moss. They shared a 9-month-old son. In 2002, she was convicted of felony murder and sentenced to a mandatory life term. Under Georgia law at the time, the judge had no discretion whatsoever. A life sentence was automatic, and there was no room to consider mitigating factors like a history of abuse. Boynton had no prior criminal record, and she spent 3 years out on bond without a single incident before her conviction. She spent the next 23 years behind bars. She earned multiple certifications while incarcerated and worked toward rebuilding herself from the inside. In 2024, Georgia passed the Survivor Justice Act, which allows judges to consider whether a person's history of abuse was a significant factor in the crime they committed. It opened a legal pathway that had never existed before for women like Boynton. On the 5th of January 2026, a Cobb County judge vacated her life sentence and resentenced her to time served, making her the first person released under the new law. She walked out at 44 years old. She has a job and is working to rebuild relationships with her 3 children and grandchildren. Irena Pretty.
Maryland's longest-serving female prisoner will now be released from prison. Ariana Pretty served 42 years after she was found guilty of first-degree murder in 1978.
In early 1978, Irena Pretty was 18 years old and in a relationship with a man named Ronald Brown, who was 5 years older and increasingly abusive and controlling. On the 6th of April, 1978, Brown ordered her to help him rob a store in Baltimore where she had previously worked. The store owner knew Pretty and unlocked the back room when she asked. Brown and an accomplice then robbed and fatally shot the owner. Pretty had also been involved in a separate incident where Brown murdered a social worker and she helped dispose of the weapon. Facing the death penalty, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, use of a handgun in a crime of violence, and accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to 60 years. Behind bars, she earned her bachelor's degree in sociology, mentored other inmates, and participated in dozens of counseling and self-improvement programs over the years. She was recommended for parole twice over the decades, but both times the sitting governor denied her release. Maryland is one of only 3 states that requires the governor to personally sign off on parole for life sentence inmates. In 2003, she wrote to Governor Ehrlich asking for lethal injection out of the overwhelming guilt she carried for the victims' families. Pretty was Maryland's longest incarcerated woman. She contracted COVID-19 in prison in 2020. Lawyers from the University of Maryland and the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Sentencing Review Unit filed a joint motion for her release. The court agreed that she had been rehabilitated and posed no danger to the public. In December 2020, a Baltimore Circuit Court judge resentenced her to time served. She was 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. In 2021, Baltimore Circuit Court judge resentenced her to time served. She was 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars. 61 years old and had spent 42 years behind bars Leslie Van Houten.
She's a convicted killer and former follower of Charles Manson and is now free after spending more than 50 years in prison. Leslie Van Houten was originally sentenced to death for her role in the Manson murders, but her sentence was commuted to life in prison. She's now out on parole.
On the 10th of August, 1969, 19-year-old Leslie Van Houten was part of a group sent by cult leader Charles Manson to the Los Feliz home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Along with Charles Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel, Van Houten participated in the brutal stabbing deaths of the couple. She held Rosemary LaBianca down and then stabbed her herself, inflicting 16 of the more than 40 wounds the victim received. Van Houten had been a homecoming princess at Monrovia High School before she fell in with Manson's group after experimenting heavily with drugs like LSD. The Manson family carried out the murders the night after the killing of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others at another location. Van Houten was involved only in the LaBianca murders. In 1971, she was sentenced to death alongside Manson and others. But in 1972, California's Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, and her sentence was commuted to life in prison. Her original conviction was later overturned due to her attorney's disappearance during the first trial. After a retrial that ended in a hung jury and a second retrial in 1978, she was convicted again and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Van Houten earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree while incarcerated. She worked as a tutor for other inmates. She was recommended for parole 5 times, starting in 2016, but Governors Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom blocked every recommendation. In May 2023, a California Court of Appeal overruled Newsom's rejection, and his office announced it would no longer challenge the decision. On the 11th of July 2023, Van Houten was released to transitional housing at 73 years old after 53 years in prison. Patty Pruitt.
She spent 38 years in prison, and every minute behind bars, she maintained her innocence.
Tonight, Patty Pruitt and her family are celebrating nearly a year of freedom. Investigative reporter Matt Fleener sat down with her recently to hear about her life now in her...
On the morning of the 18th of February, 1984, someone entered the Pruitt home in Holden, Missouri, shot 35-year-old William Edward Pruitt while he slept, and attacked his wife Patty with a knife. Patty survived. She told investigators an intruder had broken in and assaulted them both, but investigators said there was no sign of forced entry and quickly turned their focus on Patty. The murder weapon was found in a pond on the couple's 40-acre property, and police believed a boot print in the pond bed matched boots belonging to her. Prosecutors claimed she had tried to dispose of the gun by throwing it in the water. A jury convicted her of murder. The court sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole for 50 years. Pruitt has maintained her innocence since the day of the crime. She says she was raped by the intruder and that the attacker killed her husband. Her lawyers have criticized the investigation as sloppy and the trial as infected by sexist attacks on her character. DNA testing was never performed on the pajamas she wore that night, despite repeated requests. The forensic expert used by the prosecution was later discredited. She became Missouri's longest-serving female prisoner. Over the years, her 5 children, multiple state lawmakers from both political parties and legal advocacy groups pushed tirelessly for her release. Her case was featured in documentaries and covered by local and national media for decades. Bipartisan state representatives signed letters to the governor begging for mercy on her behalf. On the 20th of December 2024, Missouri Governor Mike Parson commuted her sentence. She walked out of prison at 75 years old after 40 years. The commutation does not pardon her conviction, but she is now free on parole. Lori Ann Swank.
Lori Swank took the stand Friday in the Janet Chandler murder trial. Swank, who pled guilty to second-degree murder and is awaiting a 10 to 20-year sentence, described what she saw the day Janet was murdered to Assistant Attorney General Donna Pendergast.
On the night of the 31st of January, 1979, 22-year-old Janet Chandler was working the night shift as a desk clerk at the Blue Mill Inn in Holland, Michigan. She was a Hope College student studying vocal music education, with plans to become a teacher. That night, she was abducted from the hotel, taken to a house in the area, beaten, raped, and strangled. A snowplow driver discovered her body the next day about 35 miles south, along Interstate 196. The case went cold for 27 years. In 2003, A Hope College professor and his students produced a documentary about Chandler's murder, which reignited the investigation. Detectives traced the crime back to a group of security guards who had been staying at the Blue Mill Inn during a local labor strike, along with Chandler's supervisor and roommate at the hotel, Lori Ann Swank. Swank was 21 at the time of the murder. Investigators determined she was responsible for luring Chandler into the situation. Testimony revealed that Swank had grown jealous because Chandler was more popular with the guards. In total, 6 people were charged. 4 security guards were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Robert Lynch pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received 25 years to life. Swank entered a plea deal for second-degree murder with a potential sentence of 10 to 20 years. In exchange, she was required to testify truthfully against her co-conspirators. She served her full sentence and was released in 2016. She had been living in Pennsylvania at the time of her arrest and was paroled there. She is no longer under supervision. Brenda Klubine.
Brenda Klubine spent 26 years in prison for killing her abusive husband after years of black eyes and skull fractures and broken limbs.
After years of broken bones, skull fractures, and emergency room visits, Brenda Klubine's marriage to her abusive husband reached its breaking point in a locked motel room in 1983. Her husband was a former police officer, and there were already 11 restraining orders against him. He demanded she hand over her wedding rings. When she asked why, he told her that by the next day, they would not be able to identify her body without them. Klubine struck him in the head with a wine bottle. He died from blunt force trauma. Because battered women's syndrome was not yet legally recognized in California, Klubine was unable to present evidence of the years of abuse she had documented through medical records, photographs, and witnesses. She was convicted and sentenced to 15 years to life. She was forced to give up her young son for adoption. Behind bars at the California Institution for Women, Klubine discovered that many of the other inmates had similar stories. In 1989, she founded Convicted Women Against Abuse, the first inmate-initiated and inmate-led support group for domestic violence survivors in the entire United States prison system. The group grew from 6 women to 72. Through letter-writing campaigns, media attention, and state Senate hearings, CWAA pushed for legal change. By 1992, California passed legislation allowing evidence of domestic abuse to be introduced at trial. A follow-up law in 2002 expanded those protections further. On the 22nd of October 2008, after 26 years in prison, Klubine became the 20th CWAA member to be released. Her first request as a free woman was to see Venice Beach. After getting out, she continued to return to the prison at least once a month to attend CWAA meetings. She went on to run a non-profit called Every 9 Seconds, devoted to preventing domestic violence. Glenda Virgil.
I don't have very many years left. When I went to board, which was just about 4 months ago, I said, if I have 10 years left.
In 1986, Glenda Virgil shot and killed her abusive partner, Mark Cutler Garrett, in Dulzura, California, near San Diego. He had come at her with a shovel, and she fired a single shotgun blast. Virgil had endured years of abuse. Her arrest photos showed his kick prints running up and down her back. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life. Inside the California Institution for Women, Virgil became a member of Convicted Women Against Abuse, the support group founded by fellow inmate Brenda Klubine. The group gave her something the courts never had, a space where the abuse she survived was treated as relevant to why she ended up behind bars. Over the next 2.5 decades, the parole board denied her release 8 times. At one point, she was deemed a danger to society because she had been caught with cigarettes in the facility. Virgil's health fell apart during those years. She had back surgery, developed hepatitis C, and was eventually confined to a wheelchair. In September 2012, she was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. In 2012, California's Sin by Silence bills went into effect, requiring the parole board to give serious weight to evidence of intimate partner abuse when considering cases like hers. Her attorneys at USC's Post-Conviction Justice Project petitioned for a new hearing under the new law. In May 2013, the parole board finally found her suitable for release. Governor Jerry Brown allowed the grant to stand. She had spent close to 27 years behind bars. Her story, along with Clubin's and other CWAA members, was featured in the documentary Sin by Silence, which brought national attention to women incarcerated for defending themselves against their abusers. Stasia Agu.
I'm not here today to explain away or make excuses for my wrongdoing.
It's a stressful situation when you're sitting there and you have all these people looking at you and you're basically telling some of the unpretty parts of your life story.
She grew up in a home that was falling apart from the start. One parent was a drug addict, the other cooked meth. The abuse and neglect she experienced as a child pushed her down a path that no 15-year-old should have been on. At that age, she helped plan a break-in that turned into a home invasion robbery when her co-defendants found the occupant's home unexpectedly. The victims were tied up and terrorized. Agu was arrested and sentenced as a juvenile to incarceration until the age of 21. But even after serving her time, the system followed her out the door. Washington is one of only 8 states that sells juvenile records to the public. Landlords refused to rent to her because she could not pass a background check. She applied for 35 jobs and got 2 callbacks, but when one employer learned about her felony, they pulled the offer. So she fought the system instead. She earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Washington State University, work she had started while still behind bars. After graduation, she became a research coordinator at the University of Washington, focused on disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. In 2009, Washington Governor Christine Gregoire recognized her with the state's Spirit of Youth Award. Ague then applied for a pardon and received a unanimous yes from the State Pardons and Clemency Board. Governor Gregoire granted the pardon, making Agu the first juvenile in Washington state history to receive one. She went on to serve on the Governor's Partnership Council for Juvenile Justice and was appointed to the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice. The MacArthur Foundation named her a 2012 Champion for Change. A documentary about her life, titled Stasia, won a Northwest Regional Emmy. Shauna Barry Scott.
10 and a half years I was there, I have to tip my hat to Lester because he took care of me from the day I entered prison until the day I came home.
Shauna Barry Scott was a mother of 4 from Youngstown, Ohio. Her oldest son had been murdered on the streets, shot multiple times by 2 assailants, who received sentences so short they were back in the neighborhood while Barry Scott was still behind bars. In 2005, she was convicted of possession with intent to distribute crack cocaine. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in federal prison. She served her time at Federal Prison Camp Alderson in West Virginia. The sentence was imposed under the tougher crack cocaine sentencing laws that created massive disparities between punishments for crack versus powder cocaine. Barry Scott spent 10 years inside before President Obama's clemency initiative reached her case. The program was designed specifically to address people like her, non-violent drug offenders serving sentences that no court would impose under current guidelines. In July 2015, President Obama commuted her sentence. She was released that September at 52 years old. Coming home was harder than she expected. She described the experience as a mix of overwhelming joy, fear of the unknown, and sadness for the women she left behind. She had to relearn the basics. Making toast in her own kitchen one morning, she was overwhelmed by the simple reality of having a toaster and a coffee cup. She had 4 adult children and new grandchildren who had been born while she was away. Rebuilding those relationships became her priority. Barry Scott went on to graduate with honors from a re-entry program and became an advocate for criminal justice reform. She has pushed for policies that ensure the experiences of incarcerated women are part of the broader conversation about sentencing reform and mass incarceration in the United States.